There was a time I was even interviewing for a role in a pretty kind of luxury prestige beauty company. And I remember before the interview, I got very intentional coaching on exactly what to wear, that I should be wearing a lot more makeup, that my hair should be a certain way. And, to an extent, obviously, I think most of us in a professional interview want to look presentable and, look like we've made some effort. But it was very pointed, which immediately made me understand what that potential company culture would be like, what those expectations would be like.
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today I am thrilled to have Amanda Knappman on the show. Amanda is a seasoned marketing executive in the beauty industry who's worked in both major corporations and fast-paced startups. In this episode, we dive into Amanda's career path from her entry into the beauty world to her experiences navigating the demands of this dynamic industry. Amanda shares her insights on finding the right fit in a company, and she shares some really pivotal moments in her own career, including where she faced challenging feedback and even a time where she explored her own cultural identity through the context of the company that she was working for. In this conversation, we also dive into the delicate and often confusing balance between personal expression and professional expectations. I'm excited to share this conversation with you. Let's get into it. Okay, welcome, Amanda, to Working Your Way. I'm excited to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sandhya. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so you have had a long and successful career in the beauty industry, and you've worked for big brands and super corporate environments. You've worked for up-and-coming brands and kind of startup-y, fast-paced environments. I'm curious, as it relates to the beauty industry, what do you love about the industry, and what do you find to be challenging?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so funny now when I tell people what I do or what I have been doing, and I look back because I never originally planned to actually be in the beauty industry at all. I initially was drawn to the CPG industry. I was excited about brand management, and it was after business school that I had done an internship at Procter & Gamble, and they happened to put me on the CoverGirl brand because I had requested to stay on the East Coast, and that's where it was located at the time.
Yes, location chose your fate for you.
It was because I was trying to make my way to Boston. It ended up not being exactly there, but I ended up in beauty and CoverGirl. And it was actually that experience that obviously catapulted and started my career in beauty. But it was the nature of the category itself is why I've stayed and what I love about it. It's this great balance of there's a lot of business to, kind of overarching general management that one can do within, working in marketing in a beauty company, which is something that coming out of business school I was really interested in. There's a ton of creativity in the beauty industry, which I love. And really, it's very fast paced and it changes all the time, I think, because it's so connected to pop culture or to what's going on from a social standpoint, what's going on with consumers. And those trends are always changing. So for me, I love the fast paced nature of it. It's always something new. It's always changing. You never get bored. I've always told everyone throughout kind of my career to date, that's why I love beauty. It's the fast paced trend setting nature of it keeps it really exciting and keeps it changing. And I think keeps all of us on our toes so we can't get complacent, which I really enjoy. There are stereotypes about working in the beauty world, whether it's a big company or a small company, that can be sometimes tough. It can be maybe a very competitive environment. I think that can be true, but now having been in the industry for so long, even at a company that might have a reputation like that, there's always some groups there that are great and some that might feel like they're more competitive. So I found over time, it's honestly just comes down to who you are directly working with, who you're surrounding yourself with, who your team is. And that just makes all the difference. And that can vary, whether within the same company or, company to company.
Yeah, well, I think we could say you and I worked together on CoverGirl. That's how we know each other. And I actually, when I started at Procter & Gamble, I started in beauty care, and then I verged into, household, and I kind of came back to beauty. But I will say, my CoverGirl roles or years on CoverGirl were like definitely my favorite because of exactly all those things you're talking about. It's like super trend forward. There's no like limit to how creative you can be. Whereas, maybe some brand managers on Tide would argue, but I think there's a limit to how creative you can be on laundry detergent. And there's like no limit to how
Sorry,
creative you can
laundry
be.
detergent. Yeah.
Exactly. No, it's not personal, but it's just the nature of the category, right? And then there were moments where I felt like it was like the consumerism of it all of like, do we need to be creating more trends and more products? And like, I just got overwhelmed with it at one point. And also thinking about like, my makeup routine is very simple. It's like, if it takes me more than one tool or more than like 5 minutes, I'm not doing it, And so it was just like, it was interesting to have that kind of sense of interest, personal interest in the categories, and then kind of like see how that ebbed and flowed throughout like my tenure when I was working in makeup, specifically in cosmetics.
Yeah, what's funny, beauty can definitely be super overwhelming. And similar to you, my makeup routine, for example, my beauty routine has changed dramatically, and it's gone through like different ebbs and flows over the years. Initially working at CoverGirl, working in beauty, there's this interesting like kind of balance. On one hand, because you're working in beauty, there's this great kind of encouragement, I think, and support where you can express yourself. What we wore to work back in the day when we went into an office, what we wore to work was kind of different than what you would maybe find quote unquote acceptable to wear to work in like a big corporate office. We were in our beauty office. We felt we could express ourselves. We could kind of take chances, take risks. If you had a very specific personal style, whether it was like hair or makeup or clothing, it was very encouraged and welcome to express that, I think, because of the nature of the category. On the flip side, I've worked in other offices in different beauty brands where that is true, but then maybe there's also a heavy amount of pressure of what labels are you wearing? Do you fit the makeup or hair or clothing look that this beauty brand or this beauty company thinks is appropriate? So I've always found that kind of dichotomy, I guess, really interesting and fascinating. It's like, express yourself, that's exciting, but also you feel a little bit like almost like sometimes you're back in like high school or something and you have to conform to, I don't know, what the cool girls, you know what I mean, kind of wear.
It's definitely one of those things where some companies, right, different companies to different extents, varying extents, are going to say, you are a representation of the brand, and therefore you have to look the part, dress the part, right? Represent. If it's a prestige cosmetics brand, like you have to show up that way. And it begs the question of like, how important is that really to like the quality of your work, And maybe if you don't live that lifestyle, can you really represent the consumer? Maybe there's some legitimacy to that, but also like, how much does what label you're wearing impact how your brain works and how you communicate your ideas and those types of things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, brings me back. There was a time I was even interviewing for a role in a pretty kind of luxury prestige beauty company. And I remember before the interview, I got very intentional coaching on exactly what to wear, that I should be wearing a lot more makeup, that my hair should be a certain way. And, to an extent, obviously, I think most of us in a professional interview want to look presentable and, look like we've made some effort. But it was very pointed, which immediately made me understand what that potential company culture would be like, what those expectations would be like. And it was a weird balance, right? Like, did I do it? Yes, I did. But it does kind of, it made me think, all right, there's, there is something to perception, and perception is often taken as reality. And, if that's the case in this company, that's okay, but do I want to be in a company where I would feel like I would intentionally have to kind of put on this face, or maybe put all this extra time into my appearance that maybe I wouldn't normally do. So it's an interesting, it's something interesting in general, probably for any profession almost, not just beauty.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a lot of the work that I do with companies is about creating more inclusive environments, right? And that's like, what is leadership potential? Is it really the style of how you talk, or is it like the message that you're getting across, or how effective you are at that? Like, I think there's this kind of idea of like professionalism or effectiveness or whatever looks a certain way, and
Mm-hmm.
breaking down some of those standards of like, is this actually
Hmm.
really what determines those things or not, right? And then we also, I mean, right, until we change all of the organizations and make them more
Yeah.
like equitable and inclusive, we as individuals get to choose, okay, now that I know about this place, like, is this place for me, right? And so there's a lot of complexity both in how do we make sure organizations are like focused on the right things that are actually going to drive results versus things
Hmm.
that might be, no pun intended or pun intended, cosmetic, that actually don't make a
Yeah.
difference. But then how do we get to determine what fit is right for us? And I'm curious about the beauty industry, where you mentioned like it's fast paced, it's always changing, there's always more excitement. It probably is the case, and you can tell me if this is true, that that's a good fit for you and your style and the way you like to work, whereas it may not be a great fit for plenty of other people for other reasons.
It is a good fit for me. I think I've found over the years that this kind of fast paced, always something new is something that at least continues to keep me personally interested, motivated, because I like having lots of little projects. I like starting a project, finishing a project, and looking on to the next one. And so the nature of the industry, I think, feeds into that so that I feel like I get value like all the time. I kind of get that reinforced positive reinforcement of like, okay, you've completed this awesome task, move on to the next, you know? So yeah, I think it's a good fit. And then beyond that, like working in smaller companies right now, which are even more fast paced and potentially a little more chaotic, I've also found has become a good fit for me where for me, I feel like I can be a little bit more myself and not worry so much about that perceived appearance as maybe I would in some of the larger companies I've worked in.
Yeah, so being able to have that fit of the industry and the pace and the creativity, and also having a culture where it's maybe not so rigid in the standards of how you have to physically look when you show up. Is that fair?
Yeah, and to be fair to some of those companies that I've worked with, I don't even know how much the companies themselves would ever say they've ever declared anything. It's not like they were like, here's our
Mm-hmm.
dress code. It's just, I think, the nature of sometimes working in larger companies, at least for me, there was more of my own internal pressure to make sure that, I can stand out from the crowd in a positive way. You want to make that good impression. So I felt more of that pressure to look a certain way. In the smaller company, because it's so it's really small, you speak to everyone every day, it's a much you tend to be flatter type of organizations, not quite as hierarchical. I think you develop a more informal and close relationship with coworkers, with managers, with CEOs,
Mm-hmm.
so because you've developed that more familiar relationship, I think it allows me at least to feel like I don't have to put on a show really at all, because those barriers have been broken. We're on a very comfortable basis in terms of working with each other, and we just get to focus on the work to be done.
So let's pause here for a second to talk about this. How much does how you look impact your effectiveness in the job? At the core of this question, my answer is it does not at all. But in the reality of things, there may be work environments where it can impact how effective you can be within the organization, like Amanda mentioned. If your clothing or your makeup distracts from your presentation or your ideas, as an example. Now, I don't believe that any of these things make your ideas or your presentation any less amazing, but I do believe that the bias of those in the audience can make the message not be received as well as you would want it to be. We also touched on the question of, is it mandated by the company, or are you perceiving some unspoken rules or norms? Now, when it's not mandated, it can still feel mandatory because of these biases and cultural norms. And this is where you have to decide for yourself what works for you. Now, aside from things that are inherent to who you are, for example, if there are things about the way you groom yourself or style your hair that are part of your cultural identity or race, this is a completely different topic. And it's exciting to see things like the Crown Act being passed across many states. And the Crown Act prohibits race based hair discrimination in the workplace. So this is important and it needs to be acknowledged. And frankly, it's upsetting that there even has to be a law against this, but it's where we currently are. Now, when there are factors that aren't inherently tied to your social identity, I do think it's an individual thing. It's an individual choice. I think this matters a lot to some people and matters very little to others. What does it mean to you to express yourself through your clothing? Now, if someone told me I had to wear all black to work every day, I think I'd actually be totally okay with that. And maybe even a little bit relieved, because while I do care about how I look, I've never been someone who expresses themselves through their fashion or their style. Frankly, I think my style is pretty boring and I'm okay with that. But if you're someone who cares about it and who expresses themselves through how they dress or how they do their makeup, and it's a creative outlet for you, then working in an office where you have to wear all black could actually feel very inauthentic and probably even stifling or draining. So the idea here is what works for you. And I'd encourage you to ask yourself how appearance and norms around how you dress or do your makeup or do your hair might impact you positively or negatively. Okay, let's get back to the conversation where we dive into some feedback Amanda received that really changed her professional life forever. So, kind of coming back to this, idea of like what you say and how you say it, right? There's, of course, we've been talking about physical appearance, right? Your clothing and your makeup and those things, but like also our style plays a huge role in how effective we can or can't be. And so I know you mentioned before that there was some feedback that you got kind of early in your career that felt very pivotal, like a pivotal career moment for you. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so very, very early on in my career, I worked in an office that was a completely open office. So all cubicles, no matter what level or title you were, I actually loved it because it was very social. But that meant that, if you're just working at your desk or at your cubicle, people are walking by you all the time. They see you all the time. And I remember getting some very specific feedback from my manager at the time who said, "You look angry. Like, why are you so angry all the time?" And I was so confused at first. I was like, "What do you mean? I'm not angry." But apparently I have resting angry face. I was just like, "Oh my gosh, that's just my face. That's how I look." But I did not realize that I guess when I'm really focused or working, I look very intense and very serious. I guess potentially very angry. Probably didn't help that I'm also known for being an incredibly loud typist, like bang on the keys. I mean, it became like a running joke.
Angrily typing.
So
yes,
apparently,
that's the perception.
apparently I'm just very aggressive when I work. But I remember it and it stuck with me this whole time because at the time I said, oh my, for me, I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that I was being perceived that way. And I myself truly was not actually angry. I was probably focused or just completely unaware of kind of what my resting face does. And it became a pivotal moment for me because I, from that day on, made it a very conscious goal to change that. So over the years, I worked extremely hard on, I smile a lot, I joke around a lot. I try to have a more kind of casual go lucky attitude because I don't want people to think that I'm angry when I'm not. And what's interesting is all of that work has now really become just who I am. I think it's a good reflection of how I feel on the inside. So it's not a bad thing, but it's funny now. I think if, for coworkers who I have now, maybe who didn't know me back then, I think they would be shocked to hear that because I probably am maybe even too smiley, happy, jokey sometimes in my effort to kind of overcompensate or compensate or turn that around. So it's interesting. Now it's just become a part of who I am.
Was there ever a time early on, maybe when you were trying to like make those adjustments, that it felt
Hmm.
really hard? Or
Oh my
was it
gosh,
kind of
yes.
like, oh, there's an awareness shift and I just want to like show up in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, it came, it's still hard. So not the outward kind of changing of my muscles. That part actually, it just was being very self-aware. Like honestly, even just before going into meetings and things like that, being like, okay, just make sure, you're nodding, you're smiling, you're trying to engage with the person who's speaking, that type of thing. So that just took some practice. It wasn't hard. The hard piece that continues to be hard is really specific to my actual style. So I know, and I've been given feedback before and during and after, that I can be very directive, and I can talk over people. Like I know some of the traits that I have. And so that's the hard part for me, is the directive piece, and trying not to talk over and trying to be patient, trying to listen. That's something I work on all the time.
Yeah.
Better listening. But it went hand in hand with kind of the resting angry face. So,
Yeah.
because I didn't want to be, again, I didn't want to be perceived as like angry or something, or kind of, putting the foot down. Like that's just not ever what I intend. I just get excited and I probably talk too much.
It's interesting to me because I think this is nuanced, right? I think one, many people get feedback like that or like something else earlier in their career that feels maybe unfair, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an angry person. I'm just sitting here trying to get my stuff done,
Yeah.
and I'm focused. And so there's also a lot of bias around how women should show up, right? Like clearly
Yes.
it's like smile more, like, right? We hear that all the time. And it's like something that just because I look serious at my desk, would you say that to the man sitting next to me? Like, would he look that serious? And so there's some bias that is always going to be part of the person giving the feedback. But
Yeah.
I think there's also this layer of, and what I heard from you is, and what I've kind of noticed in myself at times is like, am I showing up on the outside the way that I want to show up, the way that I want people to receive me? Like, I also have, I don't know, call it resting bitch face, call it resting serious face. I think I have more of
Serious
like
face.
resting serious face. Yeah. I have like a weird focus face that's like gives off vibes of like, do not talk to me. Right. And I'm like, no,
Yeah.
but I want people to talk to me. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's that element of like, I'm not changing myself, but I am becoming aware of something that might impact how I want to show up or how I want people to see
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I mean, it did affect me, and it wasn't all, oh my God, I'm so sorry, So I did take it obviously to heart. I mean, I'm still
Mm.
talking about it many, many years later. The way that I dealt with it at the time was really just to turn it into a self like inflicted joke. I mean, I started joking about my angry Asian resting face with, even emojis, and that was the best way that I could deal with it. But it really was because I
Mm.
was embarrassed and kind of disappointed in myself, because I didn't feel like that expressed who I really was. So yeah, I mean, it was tough in that way. It's interesting that over time with the practice, it's changed. I'm kind of pleasantly, I don't know, surprised and shocked at how I was able to actually change a trait that I think was just part of who I authentically was. And now this is who I am. And I don't have that resting face anymore, which is just crazy to me.
So you mentioned your Asian heritage, and I know there
Hmm.
was one company that you worked at, a Korean skincare company, at one point in your career that was another kind of interesting, I don't know, maybe formative moment for you, more maybe more
Mm-hmm.
personally than professionally. And what was it like to shift into working at a Korean skincare company, and why was it so important for you?
Yeah, it was another formative moment in my life. So I was adopted when I was 4 months old from South Korea. My parents, I mean, white, they grew up in New Jersey and DC. So I went through probably what some other, adoptee adopted kids probably went through. So lots of like soul searching and just trying to figure out who I am and all that good stuff. And probably didn't really become super comfortable with it until I was an adult. So when the opportunity came around for me to work for this Korean skincare brand, it was really interesting, and I was excited to take it because it scared me. from a personal level because I don't speak Korean, but I would be working with a number of Korean expats, in addition to a number of Americans, but also working with Korea because it's a global company and their headquarters is in Korea. And so this was a US, office headquarters of that company. And I didn't really know what to expect from that experience, or from my own person, my kind of personal reaction. Plus, I didn't really know what's the corporate Korean culture like, which turns out there is at least from my perspective, there was a definite, shift in kind of the corporate culture, one that I had not been exposed to before. So, I mean, as a whole, it was a great experience for me personally because I was able to learn more about Korea, was able to make more friends and connections who are Korean, was able to kind of have a little bit more of that connection, was able to go to Korea with that company, which was amazing. And what I found was, as a whole, Koreans, and this has been my experience, also like I've had Korean roommates and things like that. They really want to share everything about Korea and the culture with me because I think, at least my interpretation is, they really want to share like my roots with me, which has always been very appreciative. And so that part was absolutely lovely. The culture was fascinating because it was this weird mix of American and Korean corporate culture. And I think they're very different. So mixing them together was interesting. I'm very American, and I think I have a very American kind of business corporate culture, especially also being, a woman and, definitely grew up in like speak your mind, be a leader, all that great stuff. And I feel like there's a little bit more of an aspect of like a respect layer on the Korean culture. There's different, I think, perceptions of maybe male versus female in Korean culture too, from a corporate standpoint. Interesting. It was an interesting time because I was trying to figure out how to kind of fit in to the actual company and that industry and that category, which is very luxury, where I'm probably not the most luxury person. I mean, I love luxury goods, but maybe not like the top, trendiest like luxury goods person in the world. So fitting into that, but then also trying to balance like that American kind of upbringing I had and that business acumen I had with kind of learning this new Korean culture too. Ultimately, I think I was able to find a really nice balance and I enjoyed my time there, but that was it's just a lot of new things for me at the time.
Yeah. I mean, you talked a little bit about the apprehension kind of going into it of like, do I know enough about these things or can I fit in? Or,
Yeah.
what was
Yeah.
going through your mind, I think, at that time?
I mean, from a pure business and career standpoint, I was fascinated because it was a luxury beauty company. I'd never worked in luxury beauty before, and it was a whole new world. And that's exactly why I wanted to go work there, is to learn this new world of luxury beauty. And I, as a consumer, I think many of us love luxury beauty, but I'm not, as I mentioned, necessarily like I don't necessarily have all the luxury goods or items, surrounding me in my lifestyle. So I did feel a lot of self-imposed pressure on myself to make sure I was showing up like cosmetically, like physically, like showing up really well put together, wearing the right things. I felt a lot of pressure to make sure that I was kind of making sure I looked and appeared kind of to fit that lifestyle, even if I wasn't, living that lifestyle. That's a that was a change for me, but it was okay. It's work, but it was okay. And then I also felt that pressure to figure out how to interact and communicate better with, the Korean expats and also the global Korean headquarters, and figure out how do I navigate, this new culture that I really don't know at all. And that was kind of just starting from scratch. I mean, it really helped to have some people in the office who I was able to befriend to help guide me through that, I think, in the beginning, because I really had no idea.
For me, obviously, I was not adopted, but I did grow up in the US, right? Born and raised in Indiana. And so in the Midwest, in a very white town. And I think I've always had when I was young, I just wanted to fit in,
Yeah.
in school with everybody in the neighborhood and make friends. And I think as I've gotten older, I'm like, gosh, I wish I would have had more of my own culture, and my parents raised me the way that they did because of their own, decisions to say, like, we want her to fit in, we want her to not get made fun of, and we
Yeah.
want her to, all those things, right, for very good
Mm.
intentions. And so now I'm like, oh, I kind of wish more of my culture was forced on me when I was a kid. I would have complained at the time, I'm sure. But, kind of like having that heritage, I feel like for me, I don't think I felt American enough when I was young. I don't know that I feel Indian enough
Mm.
now, right? There's this kind of like insecurity around that I'm navigating now in my 40s, right? To say,
Never ends.
do I know my culture? Do I know where I come from? Like, I haven't spent a lot of time there. And we went back as a family in 2015, and I was thinking to myself, like, I feel like a tourist in my own country, and I
Oh,
am,
yeah.
because I was born and raised in America. So
Yeah.
it's just an interesting like experience, I think, to navigate then, right? And then to be dropped into, not only are you learning about the culture and the language, but like the workplace culture in another
Right.
country and how to navigate that and be successful within that.
Yeah, it feels like the stakes were higher in a way because obviously I'm like, I need to have a job and get paid. It's interesting. When I was younger, it was the opposite. My mother used to take me to like adoption fairs and meet all the other adoptees, specifically the Korean ones. She used to cut out pictures of models from magazines who were Asian and put them on my door. I mean, up until I was 18 years old, like living at home.
Yeah.
She really, she'd buy me Korean books. She'd try everything. And I was like, no, I don't want any of it because I just wanted to be American and, blonde hair, blue eyes, and everything
Right.
like that.
I love that she did that. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, we don't want you to,
she never
totally
stopped
lose
trying.
this part.
I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Even though you were talking, because I think kids naturally are going to be like, I don't care about that stuff. I just want to like be like my friends, right, and look
Yeah,
like my friends and all those
exactly.
kinds of things. But it seems like she has a very good heart around like kind of keeping
It
that
was very
alive for
cute.
you.
It's cute.
Yeah, yeah. So as you've kind of navigated your career, you've gone from big corporate environments to kind of, these much more fast-paced startups. Like, how has the shift amongst those things worked for you? How have you navigated that?
I had always thought early on in my career when I was working at some of the larger companies that one day I hoped to be able to feel like I learned enough, I had tools, training that I would be able to ultimately shift and work with smaller companies to help them grow. So that was always kind of in the back of my mind when I started off my career in beauty at some of the big companies. And that might stem also from the fact that before business school, before all this, I worked in a small company. My parents had a home business, that type of thing. So I think maybe that's part
Mm.
of why it was always in the back of my mind. But I've always also liked the idea of going and helping a smaller team grow and build. What I did not realize when I was able to actually finally make that shift and dive in was just how dramatically different it would be. And what was pleasantly surprising was, yes, it was different, but I was actually pretty good at it and I didn't mind it. And what I mean by that is I found some of these smaller kind of startup environments to be, fast paced too, but it's very much leave your ego at the door. You're going to roll up your sleeves. It doesn't really matter what your title is or what your level is. This is a place where you thrive if you're happy, sending out packages, and putting samples away as much as working on, next year's huge annual strategy planning or talking about I mean, no job is too small. And, it kind of was strangely freeing for me that anyone could have a great idea. Anyone could also help pitch in anywhere. I thought that I would be kind of incensed by that, but it actually ended up being the opposite. I felt like freedom and freedom of creativity and more autonomy in that way, because it felt like I wasn't still so stuck into like maybe a very specific role that you might have in a much larger company, because you have lots and lots of people to do lots of different roles. The other piece of it is there's just a lot fewer processes in some of these smaller companies. And I'm someone who I loved my time at some of our bigger companies. I love my time at P&G. I love process. I'm very type A. I absolutely love process. I love having everything in its place. So it was also surprising to me that I was able to be comfortable and actually excel in a place that doesn't usually have as much process, and ultimately able to find a nice balance of how do I bring process to this company to help it grow, but be agile enough to go with the flow, to adjust it, to not be so stuck in it has to be a very specific way, but let's create a process that works for all of us here and we can adjust as we go. So for me, it ended up being a good fit. One, because I could handle it. Like, it was okay with me to have, not as much process. It was okay for me to leave ego at the door and to be able to feel like I had to wear multiple hats. And for me, all of that was stimulating and felt almost more freeing for me. And then the second piece is it also ended up that I could be very good at it. I think that for many people, you might be great at it, but you might not enjoy the lack of process or the multiple hats. And for other people, you might love the multiple hats and the lack of process, but you may not be able to flourish in that environment. So I do think it takes certain types of people who both love or like and can flourish and do well in a smaller business or a larger business. And it's really not a reflection of anything bad or good. I think it's just you figuring out your own style.
I like the distinction of like, do you enjoy it and can you thrive in that environment, right? And like both of those things, being true is like the ultimate fit.
Yeah.
When you were talking about kind of the structure, it like made me think about like somebody who learns a skill, like say, playing piano as an example, like you learn classical technique and you learn how to read music and you learn like the process and the structure and the way that it's done, right? And then once you have that foundation, you can go and play whatever, like jazz piano, or like you can go off the book, right? You can go off script, you can do your own thing, you can play outside of the rules. And for me specifically, and I, you told me if you feel the same way, it's like having that as the start of my career, of having a lot of that structure and understanding, then I think really set me up to be able to know when I go outside of that, and for me, it's felt really helpful in that way.
I completely agree. I'm so glad that this is the path that I was able to take. It's just so fortunate, and to be able to figure out and learn along the way where I think what I like to do and what types of environments I like to work in, but also where I thrive and where I'm more successful. Because I do think there's definitely places where I've been more successful, places where I've struggled more. And about the piano thing, I took piano for 12 years. I can play a piece of classical music.
Like any good Asian child.
But I cannot improvise. Like, I have no skill in that whatsoever. I could not. So I always find that fascinating too. I love the analogy.
Yeah. I'm curious in all of this as we talk about like environments that are the right fit, the type of work you like to do, recognizing where like autonomy and flexibility and like kind of less process has been helpful. Like what has all this taught you about like your core values in your career? What's really important to you in a job or a company or role or your career in general?
Yeah. The most important thing to me is that I feel valued in whatever role I'm in or whatever company I'm in, and that I feel like I'm also providing value, because those two things ultimately make me feel fulfilled from a kind of career and job standpoint. It's also something that I ask anyone in an interview. I ask them, what makes you feel valued? Because I also want to ensure that, I or the team or the company that I'm working for can provide that to someone. Because for me, at least, it's been such a huge motivator for whether I feel successful, but also happy and fulfilled in my job. So that's the very first one, and probably the biggest one, is the valued piece. Um, and really it's all come down to the people at this point. And maybe this is also reflective of like where I am in my career, but what I've noticed at this point, the work will be the work, and I enjoy the work. But at the end of the day, if I don't enjoy the team I'm working with, and by team I mean my direct team, thinking like my colleagues, the people that I'm working with all the time, as well as, maybe like, and my managers or my leaders, I have to really feel like I don't have to put on a front with you. I can be honest with you. I can be upfront with you. We can have hard conversations. We can have easy conversations. We can support each other, but we can also give each other constructive feedback. Like those are things that I need and I enjoy and help me continue to work on my own growth. But more importantly, those are the things that mean I'm feeling very comfortable with myself. I don't feel like I have to, put on a front or put on a face or something like that. And that allows me, I think, to just feel comfortable in who I am, be able to focus on the work, be able to focus on the job, whatever the problem that we have at hand. So that's it. It's the valued and it's the people. Honestly, this point, the rest of it is great, but it's those two things.
So, Amanda mentioned how important it is for her to feel valued and how she asks people when she interviews them, what makes you feel valued? And this is really the right way to go about it. This can be really different for different people. And it's one of the ways that we can work our way. Understanding what works for you and communicating to others is a key part of that. The thing is, without us knowing these things about ourselves and sharing them with our managers and our teammates, people will make assumptions about what we want. And it's not always an active or conscious thing. It's just human nature to assume that what works for me also works for you. That I feel valued when you do for me what you would want someone to do for you. But feeling valued is a very personal thing. So I'll come back to this topic in the wrap up, and I'm going to share some ways that different people might feel valued and what you can do to explore the topic for yourself. And so I'm curious about what tools and resources or things that have been really helpful for you on your leadership journey, on your career journey. We talked about feedback that you got, which,
Oh, yeah.
Obviously feedback helps us grow, whether or not it's like a lovely delivery of it. But
Yeah.
what tools do you use? What things have you used to learn? What helps you grow and stay authentic to yourself?
Feedback is great. I hate waiting for annual feedback. I hate annual feedback. Like I hate those annual performance reviews. I get very nervous, probably many people do. I like don't want to hear that. I hate it. What I would prefer is frequent feedback. So in the moment. So did a presentation, immediate feedback. A meeting didn't go quite as planned, immediate feedback. Something happens with someone on my team, I want immediate feedback. Could I have done anything differently to help you, or things like that. So I like little, kind of feedback all the time, especially closer to the moment. I think that helps me. And so it does take effort on my part because I don't always remember to ask, where I have to, remind myself, okay, ask for the feedback, ask for if there's feedback here, give other people feedback. You know what I mean? So it is something that I constantly have to remember, oh, we need to keep doing this because it's better to do that than it is to wait until, whatever that biannual or annual review or thing like that. That's one. Mentors have been very helpful. So finding mentors in the space or out of the space, I always really appreciate them because someone who will not shy away from giving you advice, but also is really there to support you in your career, things like that. And then honestly, probably my partner. I mean, he does not hold back. He knows nothing about what I do. Like, I don't think he understands the thing I do, which is actually quite refreshing because I think he's able to very blatantly tell me when I'm being like, what are you talking about? This seems like, such a waste of time and he does a lot of
a reality check.
A lot of opposing views of like how we each might handle something. So having a friend or a partner, someone I think who might actually be very different in the way they approach work or even life can be helpful because you get that opposing view and it can be very tough to have those conversations, but it has opened my eyes. So no magic tool necessarily. I've done lots of the different like assessments and things like that. Those always help me. Some of them have stayed with me longer than others, but I've always held on to understanding that the usually like the key attributes or like strengths or like opportunities that somebody with my personality type or whatever it is. So all of those things help.
Yeah, oftentimes it's like just different shades of similar feedback, right?
Yes, and I think that helps.
I think that's normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's feedback. I mean, it's feedback. It's just really tough to ask for feedback.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Has your relationship with feedback changed in terms of like, I think some of this is just personality, but like taking feedback very personally versus kind of being able to detach or not take it so personally or not tie your worth into it. Has that been something you've navigated?
It has. And I don't know if I'm sure it's a combination of age, experience, meaning just so many years of the feedback combined, and then just the fact of, again, where kind of I sit now, kind of in my title and my level. But yeah, I'm a very sensitive person. I used to take feedback incredibly personally. I wouldn't be able to stop holding on to it for months, for years. I mean, I can hold on to some like that guilt, not guilt, but guilt or like feeling of disappointment or shame. Like I'd hold on to that for a very long time. I think it actually happened when I started working in the smaller companies. I went into it knowing that it was like a totally new environment that I wasn't privy to, and I was going to have a very open mind. And that enabled me to approach, I think, everything as if this is just a totally different type of business. Like it's a different type of business model, it's a different type of business environment. And I was mentally able to take feedback as feedback because, again, there was no structured process on feedback. So backing up, in some of the larger companies, there's a very clear language that's been developed, or there's a very clear way that people provide feedback. I mean, they use very specific phrases, and everyone in the company uses those phrases. Or the way that you're evaluated, there's a rating system, or there's, it's very prescriptive. So everyone uses the same words, everyone uses the same evaluation system, so everyone can understand what the feedback specifically means. Moving to some of the smaller companies, that doesn't exist. Everyone may have a different kind of language. There may not be such a prescribed way of providing feedback or specific words where you can interpret them in 5 million different ways. So in a weird way, that allowed me to take a step back and say, oh, if I'm being given this feedback, which sounds nothing like I've been given before, but I'm also realizing we don't have like a language or a prescribed language for this. Let me take a moment to just try to really understand what I think the feedback is and not take it personally. So that strangely allowed me to remove the personal kind of directive at myself and just try to understand what the person was trying to tell me in their words, and made it less personal. And from there, I've been able to realize that none of the feedback is personal, and I don't take it personally, even when it can feel very personal. I mean, it's all personal because it's being told to you, but I could feel very personal. Yeah. But again, it's literally like almost realizing, oh, I'm just working with another human being who I work with on a day-to-day basis. They're speaking as they speak as a human. I have an opportunity to try to make sure I understand what they're saying and interpreting it in the best way I know, because I know this person as a person, rather than let me take it at face value, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I had this conversation recently with a friend about entrepreneurship and being self-employed, and she was talking about a lot of fears that she had about doing it wrong or failing at it. And my guidance to her was like, when you work for yourself, when you're starting a business or going independent, like it's not a succeed or fail thing. It's a like, what do I need to learn? Like, how do I want to shift? Like, what's working, what's not? Like, let me change my strategy. Let me change what products I offer.
Yeah.
Let me respond to what I'm hearing, right? And so in a way it felt similar what you're describing.
It's so smart.
In the corporate world,
Yes.
it's this is the right way and this is the wrong way, and it's very standardized, right? And so
yeah,
you feel wrong when you get the feedback that tells you you're doing it wrong.
right.
Whereas when there's not a standard as much in a smaller company, maybe it's like, oh, this is just learning. I'm just like on this journey, right? We can kind of like hold it a little more lightly and say, I know I'm going into this not knowing everything. I don't know how to function in this environment. I've never been here before. And so I can just take it and roll with it and like make those adjustments as I go.
That is such a good example. I think that's exactly what it is. It's and to your point, it's like part of that thriving in this smaller environment that I was talking about before is the ability to fail up. It is the ability to have, be successful and have wins, but it's also even more so the ability to fail or make a mistake and be able to very quickly identify it, find a solution, move on, right? And because that's what keeps these smaller businesses going and growing and getting better. And so that's the same way kind of with the feedback. Take it as it is and understand it, try to digest it, figure out a solution and move forward. And you just don't want to spend a lot of time dwelling on it. There's really not time to dwell on it. It's not time to dwell on mistakes that you make in the business either. And maybe that allows for the feedback to be interpreted the same way. So if the business operates in a way where you're moving so quickly and there are mistakes often and there are learning moments often, it allows the personal feedback to not feel quite as personal, or at least to be digested, understood, and then moved on, to the next moment faster.
Yeah.
It's like so lovely to realize that feedback can be feedback and it can be a helpful tool. The ability to overcome that, I think, and not feel so take it personally is like huge. It's hard though.
Okay. Feedback is such a big and important topic. And we've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about feedback, especially when it comes to women of color, and how feedback is also sometimes given with a lot of bias from the person that's giving it. So while there's definitely a process of sorting out what you want to internalize or act on, there can be value in it, even when it's not something that you want to hear. I think the big differentiator here is the source. Is this someone you respect? And how important is their perception of you to you achieving your goals? Now, how the feedback is given can also really make a big difference too. Think about how you like to receive feedback and what makes it land well for you. What do you need to hear it? For me, as long as there's good intention of the person giving it to me, I actually really love feedback. And it means a lot to me because I'm someone who always wants to learn and grow. Now, that being said, I'll also admit that I put a lot of stock in what other people think of me. And if what I've delivered is valuable to people is super important to me. And so I definitely take it personally or get defensive at first at times when I do get feedback or criticism. It's something I'm continuing to work on. And especially deciding for myself first how I feel about my work before putting too much value on what anyone else thinks of it. And that for me is also part of growing. Okay, let's get back to the conversation and wrap up this discussion with Amanda. I love this idea of like, how do you free yourself from that, kind of this thing means something more than it really does, right? Versus this is a piece of data, right? This is a piece of information. I get to choose what I do with it. It's not an indication of my worth as a human or my future at this company or, those types of things.
Right. And mistakes happen and negative things happen. I've been pushed out of companies or been in positions where I felt pushed out of companies and didn't necessarily think that was fair. But unfair things happen. And ultimately, the first few times something negative like that happened to me, I think it was really, really hard. I mean, I struggled for a while, but then I realized I've come out on the other side better. So that experience now has allowed me to not stress over it if it happens again. So that's the experience piece, right? You realize if I've been able to get through it before and I've come out stronger, then I can get through it again if I have to go through it. Or if I get a piece of feedback, it's not the end of the world. I'll get, we'll be able to move on. So, or the fact, oh, this has happened to many, many other people before, and it will happen to many, many more people in our lives. So I take comfort in being like, I'm not the only one. I'll never be the only one, and life can move on, and you can be totally fine.
I don't know if you have studied this before, but that's like one of the three kind of core pieces of self-compassion, of mindful self-compassion, is like the common humanity aspect of it, where it's like,
Oh,
I'm not the only one who's experienced this. A lot of other people
yeah.
have. It's actually like evidence-based, like part of this process of like being more compassionate with
It
yourself.
helps me mentally. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to wrap us up here. I'm just curious, like, what is next for you as a leader in your own development or in your career?
I've always had a passion for teaching and coaching. And I realized that in my current role, I feel like I've gotten swept up in the busyness of my current role and haven't been able to lend as much time to that. But so for me, my focus is going to be trying to bring that back, because that's what, it's personal, but that's what helped me grow when I was younger, is again, these mentors or these teachers in a
Yeah.
company who really spent the time. So for me, I want to make sure that I'm not losing sight of that because I've gotten busy or something, and bring that back into what I'm doing in my team, because I also that's how I feel like I can give some value, and I really enjoy that piece. It's fulfilling to me. So that's my current focus from more of like a leadership development standpoint.
Yeah, and it's a different kind of value. Like, I'm sure you're
Hmm.
delivering tons of value and great strategy for the business, and this gets to look and feel a little bit different.
Yeah, I hope so.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your story and all your wisdom. I'm excited to see what this next chapter looks like for you.
Thanks, Sanja. I've had a great time chatting with you as always. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. I really love this conversation, from talking about our resting, angry, or serious faces to exploring childhood as someone from another culture. I'm sure that you could tell that I relate a lot to Amanda's experiences. We talked also about how big of an impact some feedback that she received early in her career had on her. And we talked about how she's explored so many different types of work environments throughout her different roles at different companies. And I hope that you could take a lot of insight away from that conversation, even if you haven't experienced a lot of different places. It's really about what enables you to thrive in an authentic way, and what takes you farther away from yourself or your natural ways of being or how you want to show up. Now, I mentioned earlier in the episode that I would return to this topic of feeling valued. And it's an important topic to explore for yourself and get really clear on what helps you feel valued so that you can share it with the people that matter. Without this, it's very easy and very common to have people do for you what they would want done for them. This is just how people operate without the availability of a better option or more knowledge. So, what makes you feel valued? A kind of more traditional answer might be, I feel valued when I get a promotion or when I get a pay raise, which can be very valid answers to this question, but they're not the only answers. So, some other common ways that people might feel valued at work and places to explore for yourself could be: one, formal recognition, like awards or visibility around your contributions, whether that's in front of the whole company or exposure to leadership about your contributions, or even informal appreciation. This can be in your day to day from a manager or a teammate, or at a smaller team meeting, or just person to person. Number two could be access to resources like mentorship, or having your organization provide a coach for you, or being able to attend special trainings or conferences. Number three, it could be things like benefits, like a flexible work arrangement, like work from home or remote work setup where you can travel and live somewhere else, or even a unique work arrangement like a 4-day work week. Those are also things that can make you feel really valued at work by having access to those different types of benefits. And the fourth one that I'll share is exposure or inclusion in decision making. This is one way that people can feel really valued. I remember when I interviewed for a job, it was my first big career pivot, and the CEO of the company asked me what I wanted. And I told him that I wanted to be involved in the strategy and the key decision making. And he said, okay, so you want a seat at the table. And that was something that made me feel valued. I wanted to be seen, and I wanted my ideas and my opinions and my perspectives to be included. And he was happy to offer that. So, what makes you feel valued? To explore it, I think you can consider the times when you felt the most seen, like your presence and your contributions really mattered. What was going on in those moments? What were you getting from people? What made you feel that way? And then maybe think about the times where you felt left out or unseen, or like you didn't have a voice, or people didn't realize everything that you'd been doing. What was happening then? What was the thing that you were missing? So by exploring these things, you can understand what makes you feel valued, and you can be specific about what you need to thrive so that you can advocate for what works for you.